So welcome to the Social Magnetic Attraction podcast. And on today's episode, I want to talk about one of the core symptoms of C-ptsd. So this is the complex trauma which is induced in early childhood, and it has a whole aftermath of problems that come with it, and some of which really affect you on an interpersonal level. So as opposed to the traditional shock trauma of having an accident, maybe in a car, and you have, every time you go in a car, you have this kind of almost reenacting of the symptoms. You have like adrenaline and flashbacks every time you go to a car. With the complex post-traumatic stress induced in early childhood, these emotional core primal wounds actually affect you in your adulthood state. So these things, I actually address the childhood wounds as really fears. So these are the core primal wounds, which are, classic symptoms of fear of abandonment, fear of rejection, fear of transparency, fear of humiliation, fear of disappointing people, fear of expressing anger, fear of expressing sadness, and many more. There's a whole host of these fears. And unfortunately, because of all these fears, your power almost gets suspended in fear. And one of the core symptoms I want to discuss today, which has been a very potent wound and part of my own recovery from C-ptsd, is actually looking at what I address as the malfunctioning fight response. So people probably know of the core survival instincts that we all have. So I'm actually going to address a little bit more than just the core ones, but these are the core ones: fight, flight, freeze, and then an additional one I'm going to talk about today is also the fawn response. So most people are probably familiar with the fight. We get angry. Our anger's there to fight for our dignity as human beings. There's the flight response, which is the fleeing the scene, retreating away from an issue or a problematic situation. The freeze response is when we don't have the ability to move away from some form of threat. We don't have the ability to fight back. So we actually almost teleport out into our consciousness. We actually just go into outer space in the realm of our imagination. We dissociate from the actual event, and we kind of wait for the predator to move away. It's almost the equivalent of in the animal kingdom of playing dead. And now the additional response as well, this is actually based on some of the stuff Pete Walker actually discusses in terms of the trauma styles, or what I call your survival style, is actually a fawn response. And this is more common with codependent individuals. So this is where, you kind of supplicate, you beg, you plead in order to control the situation. You try and dumb it down, you negotiate. It's very almost, I think one of my friends called it, you almost act like you're being kidnapped and you're a hostage. You beg and you plead as if your power is completely unavailable to you, and like you have no human rights whatsoever. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. So basically, just to set the stage of the origins of why some people have a malfunctioning fight response, which can either come in the form of an excessive fight response that even a polite no could potentially trigger, someone going into explosive rage, which obviously is out proportion to the situation, or they have a kind of maladaptive, kind of under-functioning fight response that it's completely dormant and obsolete. So primarily what I'm going to talk about today is more having or cultivating more of a proactive fight response, so you have your power available to you. In our culture, it is seen as almost this indoctrinated, really dysfunctional, negative belief that anger is bad. Now, there is a destructive form of anger. This is what people would classify as maybe rage or aggression. But obviously there is an appropriate even time to express rage and aggression in certain circumstances where maybe your survival is at risk. So it really is context specific. And, but for the most part, there is a healthy form of anger. There's a healthy form of assertiveness. Assertiveness means I respect you, I respect me. But there is, like I said, there is a healthy form of aggression as well. But I'm not really going to talk about that now. Our anger is, like I said before, it's the primal energy that allows me to fight for my dignity as a human being. It's my protection. And when you don't have your anger available to you, you have no protection. And usually the origins of this, where it occurs, is typically in the developmental stages in early childhood. A child, usually around the age of 2, goes through a stage of what is called oppositional bonding with their parent. And this is where the child begins to separate from the parent, and they need to oppose the parent in order to separate. So this is where the child around the age of 2 will begin to say, no, don't, let me do it, I'm doing it my way, it's my way, the highway. And they begin to basically set their first boundaries in the form of no. And no is a boundary word. It distances a person. It basically says, this is my limit, you can't come any closer, don't do that again. And it sets the stage then for the person, when they allow to say no to the parent, that will cascade into their adulthood. And when they are not allowed to say no, and they are shamed for anger and separating, they become overly fused with the parent. And because of this fusion, they have this, because they're not allowed, their anger has been shamed. Then when they go into adulthood, this is where it starts really coming out. And when you do not express your anger, that if you don't emote your anger, that energy will actually get turned towards the self, and this is when it mutates into self-hatred, and it can cause a lot of toxic shame. So this is where, in a situation, usually guilt is the response of when you think you've done something wrong, whereas shame is like you are something wrong. So really guilt is about doing. So a classic scenario where your anger might get converted towards self-hatred is where you're in a situation where your anger feels blocked, you can't express it, and you don't emote it out in that situation and set maybe a boundary with someone or tell someone to stop doing something. And what ends up happening is you try to emote it out, it's not available to you because your fight response is suspended in fear and shame. And what ends up happening is that anger gets turned towards you. So this the way it works in terms of the shaming as well, that it carries on this shaming. You keep doing it to yourself. Is that with guilt? Usually what happens is people with C-ptsd, which is the vast majority of the population, but it's on a continuum. Some people are highly traumatized, some people not as much. When you can't express it, you'll have a guilt response. You feel guilty for not defending yourself, and then your critic will come online because you've done something wrong. The violent inner critic comes online and then begins to shame you. Why didn't you do that? You're worthless. You're weak. You're pathetic. Whatever it is, and it can be very, very toxic. And that inner critic goes haywire, and it makes it even more difficult to actually begin expressing boundaries and anger. And I think, just to go over it, typically within the form response, especially with someone who's more codependent, something which I have grappled with a lot, and I'm in my own recovery and trying to cultivate my own anger and my own protection, my own boundaries and things of this nature. The greatest steps to taking the first steps towards recovery is first trying to tame that inner critic. That violent inner critic is the main cause of a lot of toxic shame. Like I said, it usually will occur first by guilt. You'll do something wrong in your opinion. Some rule might be indoctrinated by your parent or a friend, or by your own means, and you think you've done something wrong. Then that critic, the shame response comes online by the inner critic, and then begins to toxically shame you. Toxically shaming is the feeling of ashamed, worthless, inadequate. It's this pervasive feeling of It's a pervasive feeling of inadequacy, and it feels like you're flawed, defective, that there's something wrong with you, and that your mantra might even be, there's something wrong with me. And it's until we really heal the shame that we have our power available to us. Toxic shame is a massive block in human potential, and until that is resolved, a lot of our kind of relationship issues are going to come out. Really, something which I have learned the hard way many times over, unless you are a self-loving, self-protected, boundaried, purposeful, individual, when you go into the relationship, what will end up happening is, if you don't have boundaries, you most likely become enmeshed or a victim of abuse from that person. If you don't have a healthy form of self-love, you become excessively needy on that person for your supply of happiness. And if you don't have purpose, you will make your partner your purpose. And this is where excessive neediness comes out, that pathological loneliness. You end up prioritizing that person way too much. It becomes a codependent relationship. You don't have your own self. You're not your own individuated person anymore. And now you're kind of symbiotically bonded to this person in a very dysfunctional manner. So the moment they leave, you are literally torn apart and traumatized even more. And these symptoms get kind of amplified even more. So I think what sets the stage for a healthy fight response, especially if you're suffering more from the codependent end of the continuum of C-ptsd, what I recommend, just to kind of go over as well very, very quickly, a codependent person is someone who has kind of a lost self. It is actually classed as an addiction. Some people like to call it a disease. Some people like to call it an addiction. Call it whatever you want. But it's one of the symptoms of C-ptsd. Not everyone has this. I think people have it to varying degrees. Some people more severe than others. But it's where you don't really have a fully developed self, because you become parentified by your parent. You've had to take care of their emotional needs. And what ends up happening, these kids, unfortunately, they don't get to be kids when they need to be kids. And now they're going into their adulthood without having their developmental needs met, which you have to get from another individual. You have to get that when you're young. You can begin to heal it, though, which should give people hope, listening to this, that you can get these developmental needs met. There's ways that you can get it met. I'm not going to go too much on that, but just to set the stage for building this fight response back, some of the things that have really helped me is combative self-talk against the critic. It's like declaring war on the inner critic by saying things in your head like, no, don't talk to me like that, shut up, fuck off, don't talk to me like that, talk to me with respect, don't fucking talk to me at all. If you start talking like that internally to the inner critic, anytime you're having a shame attack, or you feel, there's been an injustice or whatever, and you haven't been able to respond effectively to the situation, internally, symbolically, you can do it against the critic. By doing this and practicing this every time you feel, if you're going in kind of emotional flashback where you feel feelings of pathological loneliness, helplessness, you feel small, toxic shame, toxic guilt, hopelessness, combat it against the critic. Use that as a way to drive against the inner critic. And that will begin to cultivate healthy instincts for self-protection, because you're practicing it in your head. So that's the cognitive aspect. And then the second thing what I recommend is angering. So this is where you actually grieve out a loss. This is a grieving technique. And you actually kind of have a mini temper tantrum. What I like to do is actually turn the volume down, make the facial expressions, tense my muscles, and kind of pretend like I'm shouting at someone, as if that person who was kind of put that injustice on me is right there in the room. I imagine there, and I tell them what I have found is wrong, and I might even set a boundary there and then. So I recommend that, because it actually dissolves fear or anxiety, and it also dissolves toxic shame, and it builds confidence. By practicing the cognitive work, you're doing the physical angering, you're grieving out your losses. It might be your losses of self-esteem, losses of feeling lonely, losses that a partner abused you, whatever it is, you begin to cultivate it back. And the third thing then is actually practicing your self-assertiveness skills, practicing saying no, practicing saying, I don't want you to talk to me like this. Good thing is actually to write down your deal breakers, something I'm doing at the moment. Write down your deal breakers in a relationship. Write down what you don't like to happen in social interactions, and these can be your boundaries. And it can't be controlling the individual, but you have to say that I don't like this behavior and I want you to either do this or I can't hang around with you. This is a boundary. You're more than welcome to be yourself, but in around me, I want you to do this. This is what I like. You need to treat me with respect. All three of them combined, the cognitive work, the physical work, and then the social skills of self-assertiveness, will begin to cultivate back a healthy fight response. So I hope that has been of value to you guys. Hope you've really enjoyed that. It's definitely something which was a massive insight for me. And if there's any questions, be sure to comment below. Share this if you found it useful. If it needs someone else to hear it. And I'll speak to you soon. Thank you very much.